Chuck Norris walked into the Oak Ridge Animal Haven expecting to leave with a warm heart and maybe a new furry friend. The sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as his boots hit the pavement with the calm certainty of a man who had stared down danger more times than he could count. The faded blue sign above the entrance smiled with cartoon puppies and a cheerful slogan promising love, care, and second chances, but something about the air felt off. He paused for just a moment, long enough to notice how eerily quiet it was despite the dozen dogs supposedly living inside. No barking. No excited paws against metal gates. Just silence and a thin chemical scent that stung his nostrils. Most visitors wouldn't have blinked. But Chuck Norris was not most visitors. He pushed open the glass door with a casual strength, and the volunteer behind the counter looked up too quickly, smiling a little too wide, her eyes not quite meeting his. The lobby was clean, almost sterile, with framed photos of happy adoptees lining the walls. It was the kind of place designed to make guilt melt into generosity. He smiled back lightly, signed the visitor log, and asked to see the dogs. The volunteer hesitated for a fraction of a second before buzzing him through. That was the first crack. The hallway was narrow and cool, with white tiles that reflected the flickering overhead lights. As he passed the first row of kennels, he noticed several dogs lying completely still, their bodies curled tight like they were trying to disappear. One lifted its head at the sound of his boots, and then laid it back down without a sound. No tail wag. No approach to the gate. Chuck's steps slowed. Something deep in his chest stirred, the instinct that had saved his life too many times to ignore. He crouched by the first kennel and studied the dog. Ribs visible. Eyes dull. A bowl of dry kibble sat untouched. The nameplate read, Rex, 7 years old, Labrador mix, friendly. But Rex didn't move. A fine film of dust covered the metal dish. The dog hadn't eaten in a while. Chuck rose slowly and continued down the hall. The further he went, the more signs appeared. A small pup with matted fur and an infected eye. A German shepherd trembling in the corner with scars that didn't look accidental. The volunteer who had escorted him tried to keep a casual pace but kept glancing over her shoulder. She made excuses. These ones are new, we're understaffed, they're just shy, but none of them sat right. Chuck asked to meet the manager, and she gave him a tight smile before disappearing through a back door. While he waited, he examined the space. There were no toys in the playroom. No dog smell in the air. No signs of love or laughter or warmth. When the manager finally emerged, he came with a handshake that squeezed too hard and a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. His name was Gary Whitmore, and he spoke in the confident rhythm of a man who had practiced this conversation 100 times. Chuck listened politely as Gary talked about funding cuts, recent adoptions, and how they just finished a deep cleaning. But the numbers didn't match the reality Chuck had just witnessed. Something inside Chuck shifted. He told Gary he wanted to make a donation, something significant, and asked if he could return tomorrow for a full tour. Gary lit up like a Christmas tree and invited him back at any time. They shook hands again, and Chuck left with a promise to return. But he didn't go home. He sat in his truck just down the road, his fingers wrapped around the steering wheel as his mind replayed every detail. He didn't believe in coincidence. Not when dogs were wasting away in silence behind a cheerful facade. He made a few calls. He contacted an old friend from the state animal welfare unit and another from a private investigative firm. Within an hour, he had background on the shelter, the management, and the funding. On paper, Oak Ridge Animal Haven looked clean. Donations from the city. Grants from 3 animal welfare organizations. Social media posts with smiling volunteers and wagging tails. But the photos were all old. The posts were scheduled. And the finances had anomalies. Transfers to unnamed vendors, expenses marked for supplies that never arrived. Over the next 2 days, Chuck visited the shelter twice more. Each time he brought treats, asking to walk a dog. Each time he was handed the same two, Buddy, a golden retriever with just enough life left to fool a casual observer, and Penny, a spaniel who licked Chuck's hand with a tremor in her limbs. He examined the grounds, the food storage, the medical room. He noted the locked closet in the back office, the staff schedules, and who never seemed to be around when the manager gave tours. His friend from the private firm sent him photos from a hidden camera planted near the dumpster. What they caught made his jaw tighten. Workers tossing out unopened food bags. Medical supplies being removed by someone who never wore a uniform. One image showed a thin, sick-looking dog shoved into a van late at night. Chuck didn't sleep that night. He replayed the manager's words, the too clean floors, the sick dogs who never made a sound. He knew abuse when he saw it, and this time it wore a mask of charity and compassion. The next morning, he returned unannounced. Gary looked surprised but tried to hide it. Chuck said he wanted to finalize the donation but needed to review the shelter's operational costs. Gary stammered but nodded. He took Chuck into the office and pulled out folders with neat spreadsheets. Chuck flipped through them, noting the discrepancies he already expected to see. Then he asked to see the supply closet. Gary hesitated. Chuck insisted. The manager's lips pressed into a tight line before he relented and unlocked the door. Inside, the shelves were mostly bare. A few cleaning products. No vet supplies. No food stock. Chuck stepped inside and tapped the wall. It was hollow. He glanced at the manager. Gary looked away. Chuck made a mental note and thanked him, acting satisfied. That afternoon, he met with the local animal control liaison and shared his findings. He presented photos, witness statements, and financial inconsistencies. He didn't mention his name in the report. He didn't need the credit. He needed results. 2 days later, Oakridge Animal Haven was raided by authorities. The dogs were rescued. Medical teams moved in. Volunteers were vetted. And Gary Whitmore was arrested for embezzlement, neglect, and cruelty. News broke across the city. People were horrified. The community that once trusted the shelter now demanded answers. Reporters tried to find out who started the investigation, but Chuck stayed silent. He watched from afar as the animals were placed in better shelters and new homes. The walls were scrubbed clean not just of grime but of lies and pain. Weeks later he returned, not to gloat, but to help. He volunteered under an alias, walking dogs, cleaning kennels, and comforting those too broken to trust again. The new management had no idea who he was. He liked it that way. He wasn't there for recognition. He was there because something had called him that first day, something beneath the surface that needed a fighter, not a donor. And Chuck Norris had never walked away from a fight worth winning. The sun crept over the rooftops of Oakridge as the city stirred to life, unaware of the quiet transformation taking place inside the once tainted walls of the shelter. The air no longer carried the sterile silence that had first unsettled Chuck, but was now laced with the faint, hopeful sounds of paws scratching floors, soft barks rising into morning light, and volunteers laughing with the kind of joy that only came from doing something that mattered. The building had changed, but so had the soul inside it. The stench of fear had been replaced by the comforting scent of fresh hay, clean water, and antiseptic. Chuck moved through the new space unnoticed, always early, always quiet, always watching. He wasn't a man who sought glory. He found satisfaction in the wag of a recovering tail, in the trust slowly forming in the eyes of a creature once too afraid to lift its head. One of those creatures was Tank, a pit bull who had arrived gaunt and shaking, his coat matted, his eyes full of betrayal. Now he greeted Chuck every morning with a low growl that had transformed into a playful huff. Chuck never forced affection. He waited, and the dogs came to him in time. Tank had taken 3 weeks. Others longer. Some, he knew, might never heal entirely. But they were safe now. And for Chuck, that was enough. News crews came and went. Activists held signs and made speeches. Donations poured in from across the state. People wanted a face to praise, a hero to celebrate. Chuck kept his name out of it. He never mentioned his part to anyone, not even the new director, a stern woman named Claire who had taken on the job with a fiery vengeance. She had guts, and she had vision. And most importantly, she had nothing to prove. She didn't know the full extent of what had happened behind those walls, but she didn't flinch when the worst stories came to light. She only asked what needed to be done, and then she did it. Chuck respected that. They never spoke much, but every time their eyes met across the yard or over a half-cleaned kennel, there was a flicker of recognition. Not of names, but of purpose. One morning, as frost clung to the edges of the grass and the dogs huddled close for warmth, Chuck found a small black puppy curled behind the water heater. She was shaking, her legs too thin to hold her up, her eyes too large for her face. Someone had slipped her over the fence during the night, like garbage left in the dark. He wrapped her in a towel and sat with her until her breathing slowed. He named her Whisper, because that's what she sounded like when she cried. Over the next week, she rarely left his side. She'd whimper if anyone else came too close, but when Chuck entered the room, her tiny tail would thump once against the floor. It wasn't just about trust. It was about recognition. As if somewhere in her young, battered mind she knew he was the one who had torn down the lie that once festered here. The one who had made space for second chances. Chuck started coming in more often. He built feeding stations, repaired broken fencing, sat with the animals during thunderstorms. And always he watched. Because change needed vigilance. He'd seen too many places that promised redemption only to slide back into decay when no one was looking. Not this one. Not again. At night, when the parking lot was empty and the dogs finally slept, Chuck would sometimes linger at the gate, the cold metal against his hands as he stared out into the darkness. He thought of Gary Whitmore, now awaiting trial, his name a curse whispered by betrayed donors and heartbroken families who had believed in the sanctuary. He wondered what kind of man could look into the eyes of a starving dog and still pocket the money meant to save it. But he didn't linger in anger. Chuck believed in action. In fixing what could be fixed. In protecting what still had a chance. That winter, the shelter published its first transparency report under Claire's leadership. Photos of every dog. Records of every donation. Lists of expenses, vet visits, adoptions. The community rallied. Volunteers doubled. A local contractor offered to build a new wing. Schools sent art projects for the walls. A mural of hand-painted paw prints went up by the east door. In the corner, one paw was different. Slightly larger. Painted in red. Whisper's paw. Chuck didn't paint it. Someone else did, a volunteer who had seen the little pup curled beside Chuck's boot day after day. They didn't know the whole story. But they saw enough to understand. One night, after a long day of repairs and a heavier than usual round of intake, Claire approached him as he hosed down the concrete. She handed him a thermos of black coffee, no words. They stood in silence, steam rising between them. Finally she said, "You're not who you say you are." Chuck didn't answer. She sipped the coffee. "But you're who we needed." Then she walked away. He smiled. That was enough. Spring came slowly, but with it came a kind of beauty that only follows after great ruin. The grass returned in patches. The sound of barking grew louder, healthier, alive. Adoptions rose. Dogs came in broken and left whole. The change was undeniable. And yet Chuck remained the same. Quiet. Focused. Purposeful. Sometimes the dogs barked wildly when he arrived, not in fear, but in recognition. As if they knew this man had fought for them before he ever touched their fur. As if they understood that he had been there when no one else dared to see the truth. One Saturday, a teenage girl adopted Tank. She had scars on her arms and eyes too old for her age. Her mother stood behind her nervously, but when the girl knelt beside the pit bull and he licked her hand gently, they both cried. Chuck watched from the side, his arms crossed, his heart full. Whisper was nearly full-grown by then. She still followed him everywhere, her ears too big for her head, her loyalty unwavering. The shelter had offered to put her up for adoption dozens of times. Chuck always said no. She wasn't up for adoption. She was already home. The news finally died down. The headlines faded. New scandals took the spotlight. But the shelter remained strong. Quiet. Just like Chuck. People forgot the name of the man who had once run it into the ground. But they remembered the place that rose from the ashes. The place that felt different. Safer. Honest. Chuck never took credit. He never wanted it. He wanted clean kennels, full bellies, healed bodies, and tails that wagged without fear. He wanted the lies to die quietly and the truth to speak through every happy bark and every pawprint on the new concrete path out back. On the 1-year anniversary of the raid, the shelter hosted an open house. Families came. Children played. Former adoptees returned with flowers and stories. Claire gave a short speech. She thanked the community, the donors, the staff. And at the end, she looked at Chuck. "We don't know who saved us," she said, "but we know he still shows up every morning before dawn and leaves after dark. He's not in the photos, but we see his work in every clean cage and every healed heart." The crowd applauded. Chuck shifted his weight and scratched Whisper behind the ears. She looked up at him with quiet adoration, and he gave her a rare smile. Not because of the applause, but because this was what he had fought for. Not recognition. Not praise. Just a place where the helpless were no longer forgotten. Where justice had a name, even if it wasn't spoken aloud. And where a man could make a difference by simply refusing to look away.